when your job is likely to be automated or disrupted by AI, and when your wage is not going to get you the down payment on the house, but actually your parents are, where's the motivation? It's really important for parents to understand the economic realities of being young now.
Do you want to be better with money, but dread the math? I get it. That's why this show is not focused on math, the markets, meme stocks, or even economic predictions. It is focused on how money fits into your daily life, from having healthy money conversations to caring for an aging parent. I'm Karen Coyne, certified financial planner professional and your host of Money Without Math. Join us for conversations that are practical, sometimes philosophical, and always fresh. Learn more about me at raymondjames.com/clarity, and be sure to subscribe. Historian and generational expert Dr. Eliza Filby is joining us today to talk about the growing power of inheritance and why today's economic outcomes are shaped less by personal income and more by family wealth. Dr. Filby and I will discuss how housing, education, careers, and even identity are being reshaped by these intergenerational transfers and what this means for families and the future. A little bit about Dr. Filby. She's a historian and author specializing in generational change, exploring how shifting values reshape work, money, family, and society. She's the author of Inheritocracy. It's time to talk about the bank of mom and dad, a Sunday top 10 bestseller. A Sunday Times top 10 bestseller. And lastly, she's an advisor and speaker and the host of It's All Relative. Welcome, Dr. Filby.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So much to cover. Let's start with, can you lay the foundation for us and tell us what is meant when you say inheritocracy?
So it's a deliberately provocative title, and an inheritocracy is a society that is increasingly governed not by how hard you work, not by what you know, not by what education you have, not even by what job you have, but whether you have access to parental wealth. That kind of generational wealth, which enables you to, leap forward in life, to have that constant safety net, to enable you to take risks and to provide a backbone of security against shocks. And increasingly in the UK, where I'm from, but actually across Western Europe and I would say the English-speaking world, the bank of mum and dad, the amount of money that's in the baby boomer generation in the US amounts to somewhere between $80 to $120 trillion that is going to cascade down the family tree over the next 20 years. We're seeing the greatest transference of wealth in human history, and that is one of the major drivers for widening gap between the affluent and the less affluent.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so we know that there's this huge wealth transfer coming, as you just stated. And I think we can also assume that this wealth transfer is not going to be evenly distributed, right? It's not that it's going to be these millions and trillions of dollars that are going to cascade evenly across the population. It will be very lumpy.
Yeah, and I think, we can, I wanted to write a book, right, that talked about the complexities of inheritance rather than set it up as the haves and the have-nots. That is important. I think it is important to acknowledge there's a growing inequality there in terms of the bank of mum and dad. But it's not the only story in town, because inheritance is a messy one, because families are messy. We could be talking about, the bank of mum and dad, which is quite controlling with how it gifts its money. We could be talking about the bank of mum and dad, which is quite reckless in how it gives its money. We could be talking about a family that is in divorce, second marriage, and very complicated by those different sort of dynamics within the blended family. It's inheritance, and I think even the notion of building generational wealth is a natural urge for, certainly I'm a mother of two, Anyone that has kids wants to create a safety net and a springboard. Anyone that has grown up with a certain degree of financial sort of instability has a desire to create stability for their family. And I think culturally, there's a real distinction in the US as opposed to the UK. In the UK, we don't talk about this stuff. It's all about, oh, no, we don't talk about money. No, thank you. And I think that comes from a history and a society where it's quite class rigid, and we have an aristocracy where that generational wealth is something we pretend no longer exists, right? It's something stuck in Downton Abbey, right? But for Americans, and half my family's Americans, so they helped me when I was writing the book kind of sort of see that cultural difference, is that you guys have a much more, firstly, litigious culture. So you have a much more sort of clearer conversations around prenups, definitely tighter restrictions on prenups. You have a much more open conversation around money and aspiration. I watch Love is Blind US obsessively, right? And it's always staggering to me how many of the couples, when they're having initial conversations about marriage and partnership and longevity and building a life together, talk about building generational wealth. I mean, that just doesn't happen in the UK. So I think there's just a really interesting conversation to be had in the context of the great wealth transfer, in the era where we have a shrinking middle class, and in an era where parents really want to ensure that their kids live this, not just like in a different and a better way than them, but even just like match them, right? And I think we are sort of in a period where downward social mobility is real for the middle class and the affluent class. And so the desire and the expectation and the need to help your kids and give them a leg up in housing, education, childcare, supplement through wages is actually just becoming quite normal in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago.
Yes. Several colleagues, I remember we were having a conversation several years ago, just kind of still close to COVID times, about how are these people still out? How are these young people out and about doing, going to concerts, going to restaurants, doing all these things? And we've heard the stats about unemployment. People aren't working, and yet they're doing all the things. And then I was stunned when I saw the stats about how many young adults are receiving support in the U.S. It's around 50% of parents supporting, or families, with 18-plus-year-olds being supported, which is the highest levels, I think, probably on record.
But I think the conversation can veer into, I didn't go to that many concerts when I was young, and I didn't have a mobile phone when I was young, and why are you buying so much coffee and, avocado on toast, like all that kind of like rehearsed narratives around young people are living sort of in a sort of level of kind of consumer excess. And that's why they can't afford houses, and that's why they have so much student debt. The reality is actually very clearly, since the 2008 financial crisis, the big ticket items in life, housing,
Certainly.
education, healthcare, have gone up, right? A lot, okay? In different degrees, in different cities, in different states, of course. But the big ticket items in life have gone up. And then you combine that with the wages haven't kept pace necessarily with those big ticket items in life. Better in the US than they are in the UK, but there's a growing disparity between house prices and wages, right? Compared to the 80s and 90s. And then you say, well, what actually has become cheap? What has become affordable? And what through affordability have we become used to? Well, okay, Wi-Fi and connected internet, particularly through our phones, the universalization of the smartphone, it's now seen as a human right, not necessarily as a luxury, right? When we talk about eating out, food, the percentage that we used to pay out each month or each week, even to in terms of food, have decreased massively. Food is actually a much smaller proportion of our expenditure than it was 30, 40 years ago, and certainly 50, 60 years ago. And so the thing is that certain things have become expensive and certain things have become cheap. And the things that have become cheap, travel, tech, eating out, have become synonymous with the generation that came of age at a time when certain things became expensive: housing, healthcare, education.
Hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, I also have two children. And, of course, I'm supporting my son who's 19 and going to college. I mean, there's no reason to give him the boot and not feed him and not, pay for insurance and things like that. And certainly, we recognize that it's probably not really realistic for him to buy or even rent a place of his own anytime soon. It's just not, the numbers just are not even close to reality.
Yes. Yes.
But it
Yes.
is, I think, so challenging for so many families where the older generation doesn't quite grasp the depth, the degree to how much things have changed, like you just described. That
Right.
no, it's not just the dining out and the avocado toasts. It's housing is exponentially more expensive than it was decades ago.
I think the other thing is that, I mean, there was a fascinating study done not long ago that the average American parent expects to be funding their kids until the age of 30. And
Hmm.
what's certainly happened is that parenting has become a 30-year financial commitment
Mm.
in a way that it, again, definitely wasn't 30 years ago and definitely wasn't 50, 60 years ago, where actually having children was a net gain quite often because they would contribute to the household. And now they're very much a drain, not a fountain on the household finances. So you've got this almost kind of what's culturally acceptable now is that, your offspring in their 20s are still living at home. You are still paying for their subscriptions, their phone, their maybe on the shared Netflix, whatever. The expectations, the financial burdens of parenthood are huge. Now that has meant a couple of things. Now, number one, you're seeing definitely this sort of delayed adolescence, this sort of arrested development that sort of started in the 90s, this phenomenon where people are taking longer to grow up and are being parented more in terms of finances, in terms of also aid. We now see a sort of staggering rise in the number of parents that are attending job interviews for Gen Z. That the nurturing and sometimes frankly the over nurturing by parents is something that can be incredibly infantilizing. And if it's combined with constant financial support, that's not necessarily always as helpful as you think it might be, right? And I think there's also, we're seeing, a tightening of the labor market because of AI. We're seeing the rewards on education, not necessarily what they were. We're seeing cost of living crisis. There is and economic shocks after basically one after another since COVID. There is a sort of real sort of genuine financial need for young people to have that safety net of their parents.
Yes.
And those that don't have that quite often are supporting their parents, right?
Mm.
And so what I'm talking about is that we talk about sort of inheritocracy as if the money's just trickling down the family tree. The truth is, we're seeing rising numbers of multi-generational households in the US, okay, and not just amongst first-generation immigrants. It's also amongst, Caucasian households as well. We're seeing a massive rise in 3 generations living under one roof. But that tells you a critical story here is at a time of economic instability and rising costs, we can't live as individual economic units. We need the family as the key safety net and point of welfare and that intergenerational dependency. And that can be in terms of money trickling down the family tree, but also care going up. The number of Gen Zers that look after grandparents, the number of millennials that are looking after their Gen Alpha kids, but also looking after their baby boomer parents. So it's really interesting that I think we're so moving into this era of not kind of 2-generation households, but 3-generation financial units.
Right. Yes. I wanted to go back to something you said a little bit ago about that wealth transfer and some of the things that can come with it, the control, which I definitely want to get back to that. But also you said reckless. What did you have in mind when you mentioned it being reckless?
So I'll tell you this through a story in the book. Actually, there was a man in his mid-30s that I interviewed who had in his own word, a very privileged upbringing. He'd lived and was raised in a very lovely village in England, in a big house with nannies and very expensive schools. And both his parents had been lawyers. And he said, I had this dreamy childhood. And then he went to Oxford University. And after Oxford, he really wanted to become an actor. So his parents basically supplemented him to have a flat in London. And he basically didn't have to work and just basically learned how to be an actor, and then basically did a sort, tried to become an actor, auditioning all the time, but never really having to work. And after 10 years of this, he was sort of hit his early 30s and decided that he was never really going to become an actor, and that his dream was best sort of should and come to an end. And he said, I reflect on the amount of help my parents gave me. They paid for me throughout college. They gave me this wonderfully privileged upbringing. I had this flat in London. I didn't have to earn money, and I wasted all of it. And I really wish they had pushed me to make it on my own terms and in my own way. And I think, and he subsequently, after failing to become an actor, then went into journalism and met a girl who he's now married to, and they now have a baby. Now, when it came to buying a house, he was given a deposit, literally a direct debit, right, that took 30 seconds. She spent 5.5 years earning and saving her deposit and building that deposit entirely on her own. And he said to me, when I met her, I was just amazed at someone who had built their own wealth, had saved their own money, had done it without help, and still has so much focus and drive. And he said, I think I was helped too much. And I think that's just such a powerful story, because there are, drivers in all parents to kind of rescue or help or move obstacles out the way for our kids, and to do that financially. Who wouldn't want to give their child a debt-free education,
especially when you have the means and more than the means,
right? But then when does that help become debilitating? And that, for me as a mother, I'm like, oh my God, what does that look like? Because I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by that dynamic, because I work with a lot of companies, and they say two things to me consistently about young people. Number one, they lack the hunger that they had 20, 30 years ago, right? The hunger, the desire, the desire to drill, get as much out of this opportunity as possible. And number two, they lack the resilience, this desire and resilience that I hear consistently from employers today. Now, I think a lot of that is overstated. I think a lot of it is about actually lack of understanding of how expensive it is to be young these days. I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that work doesn't buy you what it used to, and it doesn't come with the security that it used to. However, I do think there's a real connection between the role of the bank and mum and dad and the declining sort of resilience and hunger amongst young people. And I say that hesitantly, but I do think there's some serious truth in it. And his case, his example, I think is a really sort of fine illustration of that.
Yes, so many dynamics, that and just going back to what we were talking about. I mean, the world has changed, and blow after blow after blow that this younger generation has taken has changed their view. I don't think that they look at work and career the same way that we did, generation or two ago.
And they're right not to.
I agree.
I think, I work a lot with companies on the sort of future of jobs, future of wealth, future of work, future of the career ladder. And when your job is likely to be automated or disrupted by AI, and when your wage is not going to get you the down payment on the house, but actually your parents are, where's the motivation? Where's the security? Where's the certainty? Where's the desire? Well, it's potentially in other things. And I think the contract between employer and employee is really up for grabs and is really being upended now more than ever. It was upended in the 80s. It was upended in 2008, it really is being upended now. And so, Gen Z and I suspect Gen Alpha are questioning that in the right way.
No doubt. No doubt. Okay. I wanted to go back to the other piece, which is the control. The control, because it seems like with this parallel financial system from the bank of mom and dad, it's often implicit, not explicit, right? There's not a contractual, hey, Eliza, we're giving you X and in return we expect Z, right? Especially in the UK where there's even less talking.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by this. So in the UK, we call it a gift, a parental gift. Now, the whole point of a gift is that it comes without conditions, right? But it rarely does. Because so I think, again, going back to when I was writing the book, one of the things that really struck me was a lot of, and this is totally understandable, no judgment here, is a lot of obligation that is coming with this help. Right. So here's a down payment on a house, but you got to live within 5 miles of me. Or here's a down payment on a house, but that spare bedroom's mine. Or do you know what I mean? Like, here's a down, here's support for the kids to go to a nice college or kindergarten or whatever. But, you're coming to mine for Thanksgiving.
Right.
There is that kind of, and I think it is really implicit. But one of the things that I've really noticed is if you look at the data, what's happening about, there's sort of people are living far nearer their parents, particularly the female in-laws and the female spouse, the female line, actually, than the male line. And I think people are far less likely now to move away from their parents. And that's partly because of care, but the benefit, I mean, I have this, I live basically about 2 miles from my mum. She does pick up on Wednesday. She looks after my kids on Wednesday. So there's that, but there's also, as your parents age, the pressure and the need and the desire to be near them so that you can, that care reversal that happens in all families, you can look after the parents. But I think you're right to point out the control, because in the great wealth transfer, there is a level of infantilization that's happening with this bank of mum and dad. There is a definite power dynamic here. It's the parents that have that wealth. Now, they may be pressured to release it. They may be controlling when they release it, but there is a total imbalance. And I would argue a slight imbalance that is unhealthy sometimes. I was interviewing one guy for the book that had a really interesting his dad was from the Middle East, and he sort of said, well, I've been quite a wayward son. I'd sort of got into drugs, and I'd run away from home, and I'd not been the perfect son. And he sort of admitted that. And he said, so when it came to my dad actually helping me get a flat in London, my dad basically said, I'll loan you the money, but it's a loan, not a gift. And I'm going to charge you interest. So he said, and he said to me, in my case, the bank of mum and dad really is a bank. He said, except I would not default on my parents. I would default on a bank. But he said, do you know what? It's much more functional and healthy than some of my friends who literally have their parents' credit card in their wallet.
Mm-hmm.
Because actually, it's really clear. There's an interest. There was money exchanged. I know the deal. I will eventually pay it off. And there's a mutual respect. And I thought that was such a kind of wild but clever example of how to do that. I think the other thing is I was interviewing a woman from India, and she said to me, why are you writing a book about the bank of mum and dad? Like, she couldn't understand why this was even a thing. Because in India, and quite, not just, this isn't just unique to India, of course, but she was an Indian living in London. And she said to me, I know that, my dad was saving for my wedding since, I was born. I know that he saved for my education for about the same amount of time. We had a flat in London because my husband's parents basically bought him one. The expectation of parental wealth is absolutely there. She said, but you know what? In 5 years' time, we're going to have to move back to Mumbai. we're going to have to move back to look after and live with my in-laws and my parents. That is a reciprocal expectation, obligation. It's not just a trickle down the family tree. It's very much an intergenerational contract that, yes, is about money. It's about care. It's about mutual dependency, because that is the easiest way to survive and thrive. And I think that's the bit that's slightly missing.
And it's known. It's a known reciprocity.
Right. Right. There may be a bit of argument, of course there is, but like it's like you say, very known. And I think one of the things that a lot of my interviewees sort of, and the thing this comes out in the data in the US as well, is this sense of, particularly felt by women, is I know the care burden in an aging society falls on women. Now we can, excuse me, I know that sort of care burden potentially will fall on me. Sorry about that. And that means that I think there is a worrying sense of obligation that when it comes to looking after our parents, that will disproportionately fall on women who also may be working, who cannot look after the elderly in a way that previous generations of women did or were expected to, because they've got other pressures and may still be looking after their kids. And so I think it's less explicit, that reciprocal obligation, but it's also more complex in the Western world than it is in India, for sure.
Okay. So we could talk about so much here. We could talk about, the research around, why it's debilitating to just give your kids carte blanche, like truly just give them a credit card with no strings, right? But I think for practical purposes, a way that we can wrap up is, for families who are in this situation, whether it is the benefactor, the potential beneficiaries, what are some conversations to maybe bring this to the surface so that they're not implicit, especially if we're not talking about an Indian family where the expectations are very clear?
It's really important for parents to understand the economic realities of being young now. I think educating yourself through your kids and sometimes through your kids' friends, right, on that is really important, because I think there's one guarantee, is that your kids will have very different lives from you. And so expecting them to follow a similar path is probably something you need to drop. I think even just in terms of linear careers, or, number of kids, or how, where, and you live, I think that's a definite, is number one, is kind of like, be curious, right? Don't be curious about how the world is changing for young people. The second thing is, therefore, that curiosity is a really good way in to having more fruitful conversations with your kids about money, because life, money is money, but actually we're talking about life choices and paths. And I think that having those conversations, not about like, right, you're getting this amount of cash, you're getting this pot, and you're getting a painting behind me. Like that's too crude. What you want to do is just kind of go, have those conversations. And if you're in a blended family, that is super, super important as well. Sometimes it's really helps having a mediator, a financial advisor, having that person that can mediate and also educate across the generations is really important. I think also at the root of the desire for generational wealth is to provide stability. There's a danger that parents can be too generous. I think and actually to their own detriment. I think therefore it's helping your kids understand where you are at, what you may need, what you want to prioritize. And I think that's also really, really important, is that the thing, like the trend I see the most across the world, is parents are being too generous.
Right. And putting their own retirement at risk, for example.
Exactly. And that's a huge problem to give their kids a leg up. So I think that's that curiosity, but also that kind of really real clarity about what you have, what you need, and what's possible. And I think also, we're seeing a rising prenups, which is really sort of fascinating to me. It's they've always been quite a substantial sort of, thing in the US. They're increasing in the UK. And I think what that tells you with prenups is particularly women who are coming to marriage potentially with an inheritance, are marrying later with some wealth behind them or a good wage, are wanting a prenup, not sort of because it's completely doomed. It's because actually it's just about insurance, it's protection. And that's really important when actually quite often couples are coming together and it's not, two wages, it's one bank of mum and dad marrying another bank of mum and dad. And so quite often you're seeing parents getting involved in the prenup conversations amongst the mass affluent. Of course, it's always happened amongst the wealthy, super wealthy. Now, I think what that is really difficult. If you're going to have an open conversation around a prenup, that is really challenging because there's certain emotions, certain opinions, certain things that are said that actually can be incredibly damaging. So I think it's about sensitivity, it's about curiosity, it's about sort of recognizing what's possible and explaining to each other what's in the best interests of everyone in the family. And I think that's really, really hard and has to be nurtured and from a point of love, right? Rather
Yes,
than control,
yes.
rather than and also a kind of from a point of hand holding each other. Like, how can we like reinforce each other rather than you take from me, or it really has to be that. And I think it's not easy. And that's why I wrote the book, because it was a conversation that was inspired when my father died. My parents, who'd spent their lives really acquiring property in London, which had grown exponentially in value throughout their lives. And my dad, I describe him as an accidental millionaire. And when he died, we had to have really difficult conversations about money. And it was not easy. It was a time of extreme grief. It was a time of real vulnerability for my mother. Don't have those conversations then.
Right. Yes,
It's like,
exactly.
don't have them at a point of divorce or crisis or death, or those pivotal moments, or extreme illness, or when someone has to go into a care home. That is not the moment to have those conversations.
Yes, right. 100%. And we just had an episode about explicitly that. So, yes, and I always feel that actually a podcast or a book is a great way to open up the conversation.
Right.
How convenient.
Yeah.
And I should have said this earlier, but to be clear, like this is not about shame, right? It is what it is. And certainly, many of us can look back at the support that we received from our families. But I think to your point, being very clear, coming at it from a place of love, and also coming at it from a place of how can we do this together? We're on the same team, not of shame, not of blame. And I really do believe that a neutral starting point, perhaps, such as a book, a podcast, is a great way to just open up the conversation. You know what? I came across this episode. I want to share this with you. This is something that, I have not done a great job of talking about my expectations, but I have quietly been harboring them. And now I'm feeling X, Y, and Z. I just think that it's such a,
Do you
yeah,
know,
way to open up a conversation.
I think that's true. And actually, one of the really interesting things about my book and the promoting of the book, I've been on lots of podcasts, is the number of people that have said, I've bought this for my mum, or I shared this with my sister, or and this has basically triggered a conversation. And I think the conversation we need to have, and that was what I wanted to do with the book, is inspire people to have better conversations within their families, and actually also within their friendship groups, and hopefully within society at large, about this amount of wealth that exists within the family, and the good that can bring, but also the huge complications that can bring. And I think, just to finish, one of the things that I would really recommend is if it's as women, I think we can often be the emotional power brokers within the family, and quite often, not always, of course, increasingly it's not true, but men are the financial power brokers in the family. And I think gender plays a really interesting role here. Women, for example, are much more likely to gift in their lifetime rather than at the point of death. um Women are far less likely to take risk when it comes to financial decisions as opposed to men. And women are much more sort of focused on long-term security rather than short-term gain than men. Now, those are crude generalizations, but I think it speaks to a really overriding truth here, is that this can't be a conversation that the patriarch of the family has with a financial advisor.
Ah, yes.
Right? Right on the
Yes.
golf course. No, nada. It has to, the importance of women, mothers, daughters, aunts, grandmothers coming into this conversation, whether they, have been party to, the annual investment returns for the last 20 years, doesn't matter. I think these conversations are emotionally complex, and to have that emotional literacy, sort of steered by the women of the family is really important.
Really important. So get all the key parties at the table or on the
Right.
golf course. Well, it's been a pleasure. There's so many more directions I know that we can go in, but maybe to be continued. Dr. Filby, Eliza, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will certainly share the links to the book, to your show, and other resources so that folks can gently open up these conversations.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening. Please follow us on Spotify if you're not already, so you don't miss any future episodes. We'd also love for you to rate the show while you're there. Connect with us on social. Search Karen Coyne CFP on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. If you have feedback or if we can be of service in any way, please let us know. And now for the standard disclosures. Opinions expressed are those of Karen Coyne and not those of Raymond James Financial Services or Raymond James. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services Incorporated, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors Incorporated. Clarity Planning is not a registered broker-dealer and is independent of Raymond James Financial Services. Karen Coyne Financial Advisors, located at 12920 Connemara Drive, Suite 202, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21742. Phone 301-739-7002. Any opinions expressed by Dr. Eliza Filby are not necessarily those of Raymond James. Raymond James is not affiliated with nor endorses Dr. Eliza Filby. This podcast is for informational purposes only.